What kind of society would devise a punishment so methodical, so drawn out, that it was not only intended to end a life, but to unmake it slowly, publicly, and agonizingly? In the annals of ancient execution methods, few are as unsettling or infamous as Scaphism, a practice attributed to the Achaemenid Persian Empire, particularly under the reign of Artaxerxes II in the 4th century BCE. Known from a vivid account by Plutarch, a Greek biographer and moral philosopher writing in the 1st century CE, Scaphism, also referred to as the boats, was reportedly a Persian method of execution reserved for the gravest offenses. The term Scaphism comes from the Greek scaph, meaning trough or boat. The victim, according to historical sources, was confined between two shallow wooden vessels, limbs exposed. What followed was a calculated campaign of psychological and physical torment, but it's crucial to emphasize, while Plutarch's account is the most detailed, it remains a singular source, and some scholars question whether the full extent of the practice was ever widely implemented, or whether it reflected Greco-Roman exaggerations of Persian cruelty. This form of execution was not simply about ending a life. It was about making an example out of someone in a grotesque and drawn-out manner. The victim was to be unmade in the public eye, not just removed from the living world, but erased from the social order itself. It was a spectacle designed to instill fear and establish imperial control. The victim was subjected not to an immediate, decisive death, but to days of slow, agonizing suffering under the public gaze. This punishment was not merely about ending a life, but about breaking the spirit of those who might dare to defy the empire, who deserved this fate. The crimes that led to Scaphism in the vast Achaemenid Empire, where the law was codified under rulers like Darius the Great, and interpreted through a hierarchy of satraps and judges, justice could be swift but was not arbitrary. Scaphism was not used against common criminals or those guilty of minor offenses. It was reserved for the few whose actions were seen as not only unlawful, but corrosive to the moral or political order of the realm. The most famous recorded case comes from Plutarch, who recounts the story of a soldier named Mithridates. He was a Persian of some standing, and his downfall came not from theft or violence, but from an act of reckless pride. According to the account, Mithridates claimed responsibility for killing a rival monarch during battle, when in fact it had been King Artaxerxes II who struck the fatal blow. This boast was viewed as treasonous, not merely because it insulted the king's honor, but because it threatened the divine image of Persian kingship. In an empire where rulers were seen as chosen by Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of Zoroastrianism, undermining royal prestige was tantamount to sacrilege. This context matters. Scaphism wasn't deployed out of cruelty alone, it was symbolic. The person subjected to it was not merely executed, but unmade. They were removed from the order of the world, from dignity, from memory. Other possible offenses that could lead to Scaphism, though less well documented, likely included acts of espionage, high treason, or rebellion against the divine authority of the throne. But the common thread in all of them was this: the crime was seen as a contamination of the empire's spiritual and political fabric. Thus, Scaphism was less about justice and more about deterrence. A spectacle of control, reserved only for those whose actions struck at the heart of imperial sanctity. Milk, honey, and madness, a living death sentence. It began not with blades or fire, but with sweetness. Milk and honey, symbols of nourishment and prosperity across ancient cultures, were transformed into instruments of torment. In Scaphism, these harmless elements were weaponized to sustain life long enough for suffering to set in. The condemned was placed between two narrow boats, or sometimes hollowed logs, their body enclosed except for the head, hands, and feet. Then came the ritual of feeding copious amounts of milk and honey, force-fed until the victim could consume no more. Their exposed limbs and face were also coated in the same mixture. On the surface, it might seem strangely merciful. But this was a calculated cruelty. The nourishment wasn't meant to heal. It was meant to keep the victim alive, just barely. What followed was a slow unraveling of the mind and body, not in moments but in days. The milk and honey, under the heat of the sun, attracted insects. The sweetness, once a symbol of paradise in Persian poetry, became an invitation to torment. The internal effects of such overfeeding, combined with dehydration and exposure, created a cycle of suffering that few could endure for long. It's important to understand that the victim's death wasn't meant to be swift or even guaranteed. This was a punishment engineered to linger. The goal was duration. The victim, suspended between life and death, would suffer while nature itself completed the process and execution outsourced to the environment, one that demanded nothing but patience from its observers. Milk and honey, symbols of abundance reimagined as instruments of despair, a reminder that in the hands of empire, even sweetness could be turned against the soul. Once confined within the wooden structure and force-fed milk and honey, the victim was left exposed to the elements. There was no immediate blade, no final blow. Instead, time itself became the executioner. Sunlight beat down by day. Cold crept in by night. Insects, drawn by the sweet coatings on the skin, swarmed without end. The person remained alive, conscious, aware, and increasingly tormented by the passage of each hour. This method didn't rely on violent force. It relied on the body's own collapse and the overwhelming pressure on the mind. Hunger gave way to nausea, thirst to delirium, discomfort to complete disorientation. Bound in one position, unable to move, the victim was left to face each sensation in isolation: heat, pain, and the constant presence of crawling life. Over time, clarity slipped away. Hallucinations likely set in. In this environment, the mind could fracture long before the body failed. Plutarch, writing centuries after these events, noted that the man decayed by himself, implying that the punishment was designed to erase a person from the inside out. Although his descriptions may reflect the Greek tendency to portray Persian punishments as cruel and exotic, no modern scholar doubts that Scaphism was intended to be both public and prolonged. Its true power lay in the spectacle not just of suffering but of endurance beyond what most could imagine. The punishment could last several days, sometimes more than a week, according to historical accounts. The end was not marked by a singular moment, but by the slow extinguishing of human strength. Whether by dehydration, exposure, or the toll of untreated wounds, the body would eventually surrender. The victim, caught between life and death, was pushed to the limits of their body's endurance. As time passed, the body began to decay under the constant assault of the natural elements. The heat of the sun and the humidity of the environment accelerated the decomposition process. Insects continued to swarm, feeding on the exposed flesh and coating the victim in their crawling presence. The exposed body, now a battlefield of decay, slowly began to surrender its dignity. The mind, too, started to falter under the weight of prolonged torment. At the mercy of the environment, the victim was stripped of their humanity, both physically and mentally. The physical symptoms of decay would have been horrific. The skin, coated in milk and honey, became the perfect breeding ground for bacteria and insects. The body would have bloated, with fluids seeping from the skin and internal organs beginning to break down. The victim's body was transformed from a living person into a grotesque spectacle, a shell slowly dissolving under the slow, relentless passage of time. The stench of decay would have been overpowering, and the sounds of insects and the relentless sun beating down would have amplified the torment. But perhaps the worst aspect was the psychological toll. The victim, trapped in this inescapable condition, would have experienced a form of mental torture beyond what most could imagine. The mind, starved of water and nourishment, would have begun to slip into delirium. The constant exposure to the elements, the relentless pain, and the inability to escape the situation would have driven the victim to madness long before their body succumbed. Milk, honey, and madness, the mental breakdown ritual of Scaphism, was designed to wear down the victim's body over time, but it also exploited the mind's capacity for suffering. By keeping the victim alive just enough to experience torment, but not enough to end the suffering quickly, the executioners engineered a process that dragged on, extracting pain from every moment. The victim's mind, deprived of food, water, and sleep, would have gone into a state of madness. In the early stages, the psychological suffering would have been intense. The victim, confined to the boats, would have been fully aware of their situation. They would have felt the weight of their own helplessness as the world around them continued to spin. The knowledge that there was no escape from their fate, That death was a distant and uncertain possibility would have been enough to push the victim to the brink of insanity. As days turned into weeks, the mind would have begun to crack. Hallucinations might have set in as the brain struggled to deal with the intense stress and lack of vital resources. The inability to move, to escape, to take even a single step toward freedom would have driven the victim to the edge of their mental capacity. The lack of sleep and food would have taken its toll. The brain, deprived of the nourishment it needed, would have slowly deteriorated, leading to confusion, paranoia, and complete disorientation. Even more terrifying was the sensation of watching one's body slowly deteriorate, yet being unable to stop it. The mind would have been locked inside a body that was no longer functioning as it should. This cruel imprisonment of mind and body was a punishment designed not only to break the victim physically, but also to dehumanize them mentally. The agony was not just physical. It was emotional and psychological as well. Plutarch's account of Mithridates' suffering, which lasted for 17 days, stands as a grim testament to the mind's ability to break under such sustained pressure. Although the exact length of the punishment may be exaggerated, the essence of Scaphism remains a horrific example of how imperial powers use the human body as a tool for psychological torment. Could anyone survive? History's most sadistic punishment: can anyone, through sheer will or physical endurance, survive Scaphism? The answer, historically speaking, is a near certain no. Unlike other ancient execution methods designed for swift retribution, Scaphism operated with a cruel precision. It offered the illusion of life-sustained daily feedings, exposure to daylight, even the preservation of basic biological function, but all in service of prolonging misery. The victim's body was not destroyed quickly, and yet rescue was virtually impossible. Abandonment in remote marshes or riverbanks ensured there would be no intervention. Even if someone miraculously escaped their bindings, the state of their physical condition would make recovery almost unthinkable. There are no historical records of any person surviving the full ordeal. Plutarch's account of Mithridates, the Persian soldier condemned for boasting falsely of a royal kill, remains the clearest depiction we have. He reportedly endured the punishment for 17 days before death. Whether that specific duration is precise or not, it reinforces the same truth. Scaphism was a punishment engineered for endurance, not escape. Could a stronger constitution have helped? Possibly in the short term, but with no access to clean water, fresh air, or medical care and constant exposure to the natural elements, the body would inevitably succumb. Physical strength might delay the outcome, but it could not change it. That no one is recorded to have survived, it speaks not only to its effectiveness, but to its intentional design to leave behind no survivor, only a story. A story meant to echo as a warning through generations, a testimony of what awaited those who defied the empire in the gravest way possible. Scaphism was not merely a punishment, it was the outer edge of state-imposed suffering, where justice merged with cruelty and the body became a battlefield of endurance. In a civilization as advanced as Achaemenid Persia, it reminds us that even the most refined empires harbored darkness at their fringes. These moments reveal not just the reach of imperial power, but the limits of human resilience. Can the severity of a punishment ever truly reflect the weight of a crime?